During the last days of his stay in Paris, Napoleon received in solemn audience Vice President Melzi, accompanied by the members composing the state consultum and a deputation from the various Italian colleges, who presented him with the address by which the crown of Italy was offered to him. The next day, so as to dispose of the various matters relating to Italy and to prepare the future of his further plans concerning this peninsula. At the same time, Napoleon went to the Senate to procure a recognition of the Princess Elisa, his sister, as hereditary Princess of Piombino. The title of Prince of Piombino was conferred on her husband, together with the command of the troops charged with the defense of the coasts and of the communications between the islands of Elba and Corsica. At the same sitting of the Senate, the emperor caused the constitution of the Kingdom of Italy to be laid down in a senatus consultum. On the same day on which the emperor was proclaimed King of Italy, Admiral Brie, who, notwithstanding his shattered health, was struggling with the energy born of devotion and ambition, with the heavy duties of commander of the Bologna flotilla, died of consumption of Paris in the prime of life. This admiral had a vigorous mind in the weakliest of bodies. Napoleon, who had watched the struggle of his weakly nature, had had him sounded on the question whether he felt sufficiently strong to resist the fatigues which his command laid upon him. Brie, either out of devotion to the expedition or because he was unwilling to appear inferior in capacity to Admiral La Touche-Treville, redoubled his zeal and activity. But soon, his strength spent, he had to be transported to Paris, clinging to his post of commander-in-chief with the tenacity of a drowning man, till the hour when death came to put an end to this painful struggle. He was succeeded by Admiral Lacrosse. The emperor, having provided for the dispatch of business, and having commissioned his brother Joseph to preside over the Senate and other administrative councils during his absence, which was to last 3 months, received a farewell visit from the Pope at St. Cloud, and left on the following day, April 1st, for Italy. 4 days later, His Holiness also left loaded with costly presents, as were also the members of his suite. Having arrived in Paris in the winter, the Holy Father had awaited the spring before returning to Rome. During his stay in the capital of the empire, he had been treated with special distinction and honors. He had visited all the public establishments without exception and a large number of industrial establishments. During his visit to the National Printing Office, Marcel, the director, presented him with a magnificent typographical work, L'Oraison Dominicale, the Dominic Oracle, translated into 150 languages and printed in the characters proper to each language. The Pope had performed Mass several times at Notre Dame and at all the parish churches of Paris in turn. Everywhere the greatest respect and deference had been shown him. He left Paris in the first week of April, very much pleased with the religious revival which had been brought about in France by the Concordat, but disappointed in his principal hopes. He had been unable to obtain from the emperor the concessions which he expected from his gratitude for the step he had taken and from the influence which he hoped the now firmly established Catholicism of the French nation would have upon Napoleon's purposes. He had failed in various approaches which he had made to the new emperor on the instigation of his secret council, which was composed of cardinals and bishops imbued with the old notions of the omnipotence of the Holy See, and who only saw in the religious revolution which had taken place in France an opportunity for enforcing their ultramontane ideas. Amongst other concessions, the Pope had demanded the repeal of Bossuet's 4 propositions, guardians of the liberties of the Gallican Church, and the repeal of the Declaration of the French Clergy in 1682. He had also asked that the clergy might have the supervision of the schools, and that a public declaration should be made by the government that the Catholic religion was the dominating religion in France. These pretensions, which were put forward by the Holy Father as points of ecclesiastical discipline, were repelled by Napoleon with all the respect due to the head of the church, but with invincible firmness. Another question, which more closely concerned the Holy See, was the restitution of the legations of the pontifical states. Napoleon had to show himself inflexible on this point, as on the others. The Pope accordingly quitted Paris, regretting to have shown a condescension for which he considered himself very poorly rewarded. His Holiness joined the Emperor at Piedmont and renewed his leave-taking at the royal castle of Stupigny. Thence he continued his journey to Rome, where he arrived 8 months after his departure from the Eternal City to crown the new Charlemagne in his capital. It has been noticed that the few sovereigns who were crowned by the Pope went to Rome to receive their consecrations at the hand of St. Peter's successor, Pope Leo III, crowned in Rome as Emperor of the Western Empire Charlemagne, the benefactor of the Holy See and the first author of its power. Napoleon was accompanied in his journey to Italy by the Empress Josephine, Cardinal Caparat, Archbishop of Milan, who was to crown the King of Italy, had preceded him. The emperor had sent the Grand Master of Ceremonies and part of his court on in front. The rest escorted him on his journey, and Abbés Prat and de Broglie accompanied him as almoners. These two prelates, restored to reason, appeared to be fully reconciled to the new regime, which was established in our country. These two abbés vied with each other in admiration of and devotion to the genius who raised France so high amongst the nations. Their conversations with the emperor's aides-de-camp during the journeys were most secular and gay in tone, and both showed themselves very gallant with the ladies of the palace. They were both men of wit, but Abbé Prat excelled by his unceasing flow of conversation. Woe to anyone who, in conversation with him, should chance to pause to use his handkerchief or to take a breath. The word was taken from his mouth, and there was no hope of his ever getting a chance to put in another. Monsieur de Prat was loaded with gifts and honors by Napoleon, but when he saw that the empire was on its decline, the almoner of the god Mars found out that he had only been serving at the altars of Jupiter Scapan. He made amends for this aberration in certain writings which do more credit to his intelligence than to his heart. In one word, his disloyalty can only be described as most scandalous. Monsieur de Broglie did not act like Monsieur de Prat, who only insulted the idol when it had been overthrown. Having become the first bishop of Acqui and then Bishop of Ghent, his attitude and his language changed as soon as the difficulties between the emperor and the pope arose. His estrangement from the imperial government was as sudden as it was striking. God's elect became, in this prelate's eyes, the enemy of religion and the Antichrist. He took part resolutely against the emperor, and rejecting with an ardent and obstinate passion all attempts made by Napoleon to conciliate them, refused even to accept the decoration of the Legion of Honor, wishing to take nothing from the emperor's hands. His fanaticism reached such a pitch that his ambition was not for the martyr's palm, the days of martyrdom having passed by, but for that a confessor of the faith. He was confined in Vincennes and forced to resign his seat to gain his liberty. He did not, however, consider himself deprived of his episcopal authority and continued in secret communication with his clergy, bringing fresh disgrace thereby upon himself. After the fall of the empire, he was reinstated in his episcopal functions, but lived on no better terms with the Dutch government. 3 years after he was sentenced, per contumaciam, to transportation by the Brussels Court of Assizes for the crime of disobedience to the laws of the state. At the same time, he was a man of good faith who was respected for his learning and his irreproachable morals. The emperor halted for several days at Lyon and at Turin. Mont-Cenis was crossed in the way, which was customary at that time. The carriages had to be taken to pieces, and the travelers had to make their way by steep paths, interrupted at each step. Trusty and sure-footed men carried the travelers and their luggage on their backs or in sedan chairs. Other mountaineers placed in the front of a kind of sledge, and armed with ferruled sticks, guided their rapid course with marvelous dexterity. When we again crossed this mountain in 1807, a broad and fine road, with a gentle and easy slope, had taken the place of all this chaos. The road was so easy that it was not necessary to put the drag on the post-chaises. On his arrival at Alessandria, Napoleon visited the immense fortifications which he had ordered and held a grand review on the battlefield of Marengo. The maneuvers, commanded by Marshal Lannes, were executed on the same plains which 5 years previously had been the scene of the battle. Napoleon had had the coat and the hat which he had worn on that memorable day brought from Paris and put them on the day of the review. The sight of this old uniform excited the enthusiasm of the soldiers, most of whom had seen its glitter in the thick of the fire of the great battle, and its dingy embroideries recalled more vividly a memory eminently glorious to French arms, the memory of a victory which had produced such great results. The emperor found his brother Jerome at Alessandria, who had hastened thither on his return from America to have an interview with him. He came from Genoa, where he had left the brig L'Epervier, which he was commanding. The interview was a stormy one, for the emperor refused to acknowledge his brother's marriage with Miss Patterson, contracted at a time when the young spouses were under age. The birth of a son, issue of this marriage, had prompted Jerome to oppose a violent resistance to Napoleon's will. He was forced, however, to yield to the irresistible superiority of his brother's will and returned immediately after this interview to Genoa, where he awaited the emperor's arrival on board his ship. From Alessandria, Napoleon proceeded to Pavia, where he spent 2 days. He received there a large deputation which had come from Milan to congratulate him, and which helped to swell his procession at the imposing entry which, on May 13th, he made into this capital. The emperor was received in Milan with enthusiastic demonstrations, rendered more emphatic by the Italian character. The 15 days which preceded his coronation were employed in completing the preparations for this ceremony. He went to visit the Duomo, the Cathedral of Milan, the pride of Lombardy, an immense church ornamented with a prodigious number of marble statues. He gave orders for the completion of this fine building, which had so long been neglected, a constant subject of regret to the Milanese. It was in this cathedral that, on May 26, 1805, the coronation of the King of Italy took place with the greatest pomp. The iron crown, which had been used for the enthronement of the Lombard kings, had been brought from Monza, where it was preserved as a historical relic. Napoleon placed it on his head with his own hands, as he had done with the imperial crown at Notre Dame, repeating in a loud voice the words inscribed on the circle of the crown: Dio mi la diede, guai a chi la tocca. God gave this to me. Beware, too, he who takes it. The emperor was not crowned queen. The empress was not crowned queen and watched the ceremony from a gallery on the right of the altar. The coronation was followed by fetes and popular amusements, amongst others being sports in a circus constructed after the Roman model, a poor imitation of the antique sports. The theatra of La Scala displayed all its talent. At the head of the leading singers of Italy figured the celebrated Marchesi, one of the most astonishing eunuchs which the musical conservatories of the country have ever produced. Marchesi's voice, which had been the object of universal admiration, was heard there for the last time. Enthusiastic about his art, he had himself operated upon, although already in the prime of life. At the time of coronation, he was 63 years old. His voice, perfected by the excellence of its method, had remained mellow, pure, and of charming sweetness. He was, moreover, an excellent actor. The audience granted to the Doge and to the deputations of the Senate and people of Genoa afforded an imposing spectacle. The Order of the Crown of Iron was created, and a constitutional statute settling the organization of the Kingdom of Italy was presented to the legislative corps. Prince Eugene took the oath as viceroy. The constitution provided that the crown of Italy should be hereditary, to the exclusion of women, that adoption could only extend to a Frenchman or an Italian, that as soon as the foreign armies should have evacuated the state of Naples, the Ionian Islands, and the island of Malta, Napoleon would transmit his crown to one of his male children, legitimate, natural, or adopted, and that from that time forward, the crown of Italy could no longer be united to the crown of France on the same head, and that Napoleon's successors should constantly reside on the territory of Italy. After having provided for the general scheme and the most minute details of the constitution of his new kingdom, Napoleon left Milan to visit the different provinces. A large camp had been formed in the plain of Monte Chiaro, the scene of the Battle of Castiglione, and a review was held here before the emperor when, as at Marengo, he distributed rewards and decorations. He next visited the fortified towns of Mantua, Peschiera, Verona, and Legnano. The object of these demonstrations was to teach the enemies of France, who were then agitating Germany, to appreciate our military resources, the fine deportment of our troops, their familiarity with war, and the fine spirit with which they were animated. The union of Genoa to the empire was accomplished at Milan, the precarious condition of this republic, a desire to acquire its harbor, and especially the harbor of Spezia, which was large and safe enough to form the site of a large maritime establishment. And it may also be said the favorable tendencies of the people decided Napoleon. The Genoese expected a safer future and the efficacious protection of their commerce from their incorporation with France. It was this that decided the Senate of Genoa and the Doge himself to go to Milan and to express their wishes on this subject to the emperor. During his stay at Bologna, a deputation from the Principality of Lucca, prompted by the same motives, came to ask him to take their country under his protection. There was no need of intimidation on his part to extort the expression of these wishes from these two small states. It was so much to their interest to form integral parts of the empire that they were quite naturally brought to express their desire so to become. Napoleon refused the offer of the Lucans, but he gave them a constitution and handed over the sovereignty of Lucca to his sister Eliza, who added it to the Duchy of Piombino, with which a senatus consultum had 3 months previously invested her. The emperor only stayed 24 hours at Parma. He met there with Monsieur Moreau de Saint-Méry, who, owing to the influence of the Empress Josephine, whose compatriot and relation he was, had been appointed Counselor of State and Director General of the States of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastella. This director, a man of merit and probity, who at the beginning of the troubles of the Revolution had showed firmness as well as moderation, governed these states in a feeble manner, being almost entirely taken up with arts and literature. His way of governing was not in harmony with Napoleon's active and positive processes of administration. He had had a treatise on dancing, printed in a luxurious manner by Bodoni, and this displeased the emperor. A mutiny of the militia of the state of Parma, severely repressed by Junot, was sent there with extraordinary powers, was imputed to Moreau de Saint-Méry's weakness. He was recalled, and the states of Parma, divided into departments and placed under the French administration, became part of the general organization of the empire. On his return to France, Moreau de Saint-Méry was coldly received by the emperor. Consigned to oblivion, he received, as the reward of his services, only a moderate pension, which was increased by Empress Josephine's liberalities. Napoleon kept the promises which he had made to the Genoese deputation. He went to Genoa to receive the homage of the new subjects of the empire and devoted his attention to the organization of the various departments of the government. The Minister of the Interior had proceeded to the Emperor to Genoa, and the Arch-Treasurer, who was commissioned to establish the French regime in this country, was there also. Napoleon was received like a liberator, with effusive demonstrations of gratitude and admiration. Splendid fetes were given in his honor. The fete in the roads of Genoa at which he was present was fairy-like in splendor. The emperor, accompanied by the Empress Josephine and the whole court, crossed the terrace of the Doria Palace, which he occupied, and came down the great marble staircase which goes out to the sea, and from the steps of which Andrea Doria used to embark on board his admiral's galley. Here he got on board an immense rotunda, with columns painted in white and gold, rowed by 100 oarsmen in rich attire. This rotunda was immediately rowed off towards the harbor, where a regatta was in progress. At the close of the day, numerous floating islands, joining on to this temple as if by enchantment, formed in the middle of the waves a garden filled with trees and flowers, and ornamented with statues and springing fountains. As the night grew dark, a display of fireworks took place, which lighted up the whole of the roads and the numerous buildings built in an amphitheater around them.